Hi, Arun.
Uh,
Hi. So we are starting in 5 minutes, right?
oh yeah, hopefully students will come. Yeah,
Yeah,
starting in 5 minutes.
that's okay. I'll come back in 5 minutes, right? I'm on.
Somebody is coordinating for you to give entry to students. Huh?
Sorry, just a minute.
Yeah, you will be speaking. Somebody has to coordinate.
Yeah, I've got my headphones on. Uh,
Okay.
so I'll come back in 5 minutes, right?
Yeah. Okay. No problem.
Yeah. So I'm here.
Okay. No issue.
ये इतना वर्ड्स ठीक है, कम नहीं है। और की थोड़ा सा, और कीवर्ड्स कीवर्ड्स डालो। ओके बाय।
Shani, you have to mute yourself. Ishani, you have to mute yourself. It's disturbing. Ishani, you have to mute yourself.
So,
Shall we start or wait for 1 or 2 minutes?
sorry, we can.
Oh.
Shall we start now?
We can, yeah. Because
Okay.
by the time
So-
you start your lecture, it will be another 5 minutes. So, anyway, I welcome Professor Sudipta Kaviraj to my class on Gramsci's political thought. And all of you know about his works, but what you don't know, I will tell you. That is part of oral tradition in JNU, and I being one of his students, remember him as a good teacher. He was excellent, and he was actually a kind of a encyclopedic teacher who taught us subject very well with a lot of passion, a lot of commitment. And especially I was particularly influenced by him. My inclination towards Gramsci, for that partly he was responsible because he was very popular. He was actually a popular writer. He used to write on Gramsci those days. So those writings considerably influenced me in my formative year. And one of the things which is remarkable about him, which I would like to share with most of you, is his way he taught us Marx. That is absolutely phenomenal, and nobody else has ever thought of Marx the way he imagined in 1982. So, the last 40 years that Marx remained with me while teaching my own students, and finally it came out from my mind, and I have unpacked him. His Marx, actually, I presented in my way. It will be published in EPW very soon, the Marx epistemology. That is absolutely brilliant, the way he presented Marx epistemology. I merely summarized and presented in my own way. I hope when it published, you would like to read and comment on the paper. So with this informal welcome, Professor Kaviraj, I would like to request Ann to give a formal introduction.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone.
Would you?
Am I audible?
Yes, but could people open the video? Yeah. No, I want the others also to open the video so that I can see the people I'm talking to. Yeah. Anyway, carry on.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, who has graciously accepted our invitation to deliver a lecture on Gramsci's Historicism. Professor Kaviraj is a renowned theorist focused on intellectual history and Indian politics. Some of his works include The Invention of Private Life, Trajectories of the Indian State, and The Imaginary Institution of India, among others. He is currently a professor of Indian politics and intellectual history at Columbia University and has previously taught at SOAS, London, and JNU. His fair engagement with Marxist thought and historical embeddedness of ideas resonates deeply with the topic at hand today. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Kaviraj to deliver this lecture today. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Arun, should I start now? So, no, I'm very pleased. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me
Yes, sir.
clearly? Okay.
Yes, sir. Y- Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. No, I'm very pleased to be able to give this lecture to you because I I do have an opportunity of talking to students who are very diverse from across the world, but um, I don't get opportunities easily to talk to a group of Indian students coming from a single university, which is a different kind of setting, and I appreciate that very much. So what I shall do is I'll divide my lecture into two parts. In the first part, I would, three parts. In the first part, I'll talk a little bit briefly about the meaning of the term historicism, because there are two meanings of the term, and we do not fight too much about which one is right and which is wrong. But I think it's important to keep in mind that these two meanings of historicism are very different, and we shouldn't confuse between them. And secondly, I'll turn to Gramsci, and I'll suggest that in Gramsci there are six different elements in his thinking generally, which are all historicist. So my description of Gramsci as a historicist thinker is not a kind of vague general characterization. When we characterize the thinker as anything, historicist or uh, non-historicist, positivist or whatever, um, we should try to go beyond the general characterization, which doesn't tell us very much except very generally, and try to make that argument good by looking closely at the details of the argumentation. So that is what I'll try to do in the second part, um, picking up six different elements in Gramsci, which are all historicist, and which therefore establishes my claim that Gramsci, within the Marxist tradition, is primarily a historicist thinker. At the end, I want to spend about a few minutes talking about how we should use Gramsci, not in thinking about Italy, which was his object of historical thought, but thinking about India, because we read Gramsci not to become scholars of the history of Marxism as a historical theory, but essentially to try to understand our history in India. And there again, I think you will see that the way I look at the question differs in some ways from the way a lot of others, or even broadly Marxists generally, treat that question. And therefore, as you are students, you are at a stage of your life where you are looking at many different ways of thinking about a particular question. I think this gives you an opportunity of reflecting on this, thinking about it, and then deciding on your own, which way of responding to the question appears to be preferable to you, so that should be reflected in your own work. So I learned historicism through Gramsci in a certain sense, and I uh, also learned about Gramsci through historicism. But uh, let us start with the meaning of historicism. What is historicism? There are two meanings of the term historicism. The original meaning comes from the modern German tradition. If you think of the word, the concept itself in the narrower sense, uh, we could say that it originates in people like Wilhelm Dilthey, who uh, who is a thinker in the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th. But in a broader sense, we could say, and it's important to make this remark when thinking about Gramsci, uh, what we call historicism today actually originates in Hegel, and particularly in two very big assertions in Hegel. One is, it's not Hegel who said that if you want to understand the human world, one of the most important constituents of that world is consciousness. human consciousness. Hegel is not the first to make that point strongly. Kant makes that, and other people in other traditions also make that. But Hegel introduces a twist into it, which I think is very significant, peculiar to Hegel, but then it expands and becomes very important in the entire historicist tradition, which is the simple recognition that consciousness always includes the question of self-consciousness. So when you say human beings are conscious, of course, human beings are conscious in a way which they share with the animal world. You are conscious about the world. But when you are talking of consciousness among human beings, then one of the essential components of that consciousness is self-consciousness. That consciousness turns upon itself, inquires about itself, and things like that. And you can immediately see that we can um, go from that proposition into something which concerns our kind of activity in the academia, that an extension of that idea would be that we are being trained to think, and one of the important aspects of thinking is thinking about thinking, which is not which is not a mysterious statement. Thinking about thinking essentially means trying to be clear about the methods of thinking that we are following when we are thinking about any historical object or any historical process. So this is something which is very important in Hegel. Consciousness is self-consciousness. And also the Hegelian idea that lapse of time, how things change or reconstitute themselves are put in different types of, if you use a Buddhist kind of term, assemblages, of different elements. This is absolutely central if we try to understand the historical world, the human world, sorry, the human world. And it is because of that that I think these are the two essential ideas that Hegel brings into the study of the human world, which did not exist before, at least in this strong form. And these two become two very important constituents of the historicist tradition. So the original meaning of historicism comes from Dilthey. Many of you know that Dilthey makes a distinction almost for the first time when he thinks about what is scientific study, what does it mean for people to think about something scientifically. He stresses the point that scientific thinking must be split into two types, which are both right in their own provinces, but they're not right across the boundary between nature and history. So the natural world, when it's understood scientifically, uses the scientific method in one way, looking for explanation, law-like generalizations, etc. And the human world, although it is linked to and imbricated with the natural world, is a world of a very different type of constitution. And because of that, the method that we follow for understanding the human world is different from the methods that we follow in understanding the natural world. People who believe that it is the same method are positivists, and people who believe that the understanding of the historical world needs to be scientific, but the method of that science is fundamentally different. They are historicists. So I would make a distinction between these two, following upon the original distinction made by Dilthey between the Naturwissenschaften, that is sciences of nature, and the Geisteswissenschaften, sciences of the spirit. Geist in Hegel is spirit. And you can see how Hegelian this phraseology is, because Geist is one of the central concepts in Hegel. And in naming the social sciences the Geisteswissenschaften, Dilthey reveals and acknowledges, in a sense, the Hegelian heritage of his thinking. So what is the main point of this form of historicism? The main point is that we try to understand the reasons behind human action. If you want to understand human action, you should not try to look for causes in the sense in which causal explanations are thought of in the natural sciences, you should think of rational explanations. Rational meaning here, explanations which, or understanding which relates a particular action to a reason. So if we want to, if we ask the question, what is the nature of this action? A further reading of that question would be, why did that particular individual or agent undertake that action? And we cannot understand that if we somehow cannot relate to the intention which went into that action and lay behind it. So this is the first historicist view. And when I use the term historicism, I always use it in this particular sense. But there is also another meaning of the term historicism, which was introduced strangely by the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, um, who was a Viennese Austrian philosopher, but spent much of his time in London and participated in some ways in the background philosophical discussions of the Cold War. And he uses the term historicism. Books like Open Society and Its Enemies and things like that uses the term historicism this way. Historicism in his case means something completely different. It means essentially a theory of history which is ideal, meaning a theory of history which thinks of history not as a sequence of unrelated and chaotic events and incidents. It thinks of history in terms of stages. And its understanding of history is also teleological, in the sense that it believes that the stages come in a particular inflexible order. And it also believes, on top of that, which is a very problematic idea, that simply because history goes in stages or history has a certain kind of direction, at any point in history where you are located, you can actually surmise the direction in which history would go in the future. Or, even more strongly, Popper believes that Marxist, I do not think this is a true understanding of either Marx or Marxism, but Popper believes that Marxists necessarily believe in a kind of historical inevitability of a path in which capitalism is destroyed and a certain form of society, which Marx calls socialism, is realized. The important thing in Popper is not the nature of that society, but the teleology. That he believes that if you believe in historicism like Marx or like Hegel, then you have a teleological view of history. You believe that you can see history leading to a kind of inevitable terminal point. So you can see that the meaning of the term historicism in these two contexts is vastly different. I use the term historicism in the first sense, in which it is used mainly in German social science, sociology, history, philosophy. But if you look at somebody who is an important figure in modern social science, Dipesh Chakraborty, for instance, in Provincializing Europe, Dipesh clearly uses the Popperian term, Popperian meaning of historicism. I do not do that. Now, there is a tendency in Marxist thought as well, which sees historical teleology as problematic and which sees a certain kind of Marxism as historicist and teleological. Althusser, in Reading Capital, has a chapter, a very eloquent, powerfully argued chapter, but in my view, the argument is not, I do not find the argument entirely convincing. Uh, the title of that chapter is Marxism is not Historicism. So he is strongly opposed to a historicist reading of Marx in some ways. I cannot get into the detail of that discussion with you. I'm writing a paper now in which I want to argue, in spite of a very deep influence of Althusser in my thinking, not merely in my very early days when I taught Arun, my mind was completely full of Althusser. And but even later, I still retain a very great deal of influence of Althusser's thinking about Marx. But I feel that on this question, Althusser is simply wrong. And the paper that I'm trying to write now wants to show that some of the very distinguished work that Althusser himself did, like his analysis of the young Marx in For Marx, the method of that analysis is actually historicist. Although Althusser repudiates historicism, I believe that some of the best work in Althusser's own writing is historicist in its methodological character. Now, so let me now turn to a second point very quickly and make a distinction broadly between a Hegelian trajectory in Marxist thought and an anti-Hegelian trajectory, which we can call, from what I said at the start, historicist and positivist. And in Indian Marxism particularly, in Indian Marxism, which is spread by intellectuals of political parties, especially, there's a very great influence of Lenin. And I have felt gradually through my own evolution that it's important to see the distinction between the Gramsci kind of argument, which is historicist, and the Lenin kind of argument, which is essentially positivist, and make a distinction and make a choice sometimes. So my argument would be that these two lines of thought within Marxism are very clear and distinguishable. For instance, if you look at Western Marxism, the people who are representatives of great historicist Hegelian Marxist thinking would be Gramsci, Lukács, the Hungarian philosopher who wrote primarily in German, is a big Hegelian Marxist figure. And there are also lots of Hegelian Marxist figures later on. And among the anti-Hegelian figures in European Marxism, Althusser is a good example. But there are many others who are followers of Lenin philosophically on many issues. They should be seen as representing the anti-Hegelian strand in Marxist thought. Let me make a couple of points about Lenin very quickly. And I'll make a remark which I wanted to notice that closely, and we can have a discussion about that later on. My argument would be that some parts of Lenin, which are very valuable, are actually historicist forms of thinking. So Lenin's analysis, I think, are rescued or are important because of his sharp analysis of a sense of the logic of situations. For instance, Lenin apparently said in a speech the day before the Russian Revolution that they were deciding which day they should take the initiative to start the revolution. The bombardment from the ship called Potemkin, which would signal the making of the Russian Revolution. And Lenin made a famous speech in which he made the famous statement that 6th would be too early and 8th would be too late. And so you can see here that what is reflected is a very sharp sense of timing and a very sharp sense of what we can call more theoretically a logic of situations. That is, what would be the combination of circumstances on the 6th, and what would be the combination of circumstances on the 7th and the 8th, which are different. So this is the logic of historical thinking, because the Buddhists, for instance, would say that when we try to understand the human world, it's very important to understand what are the traces left by time, or what are the traces of time. So historicism is a theory which says that we should never forget and should always look for the traces of time in human affairs. And this is a very good example to illustrate the importance of the traces of time or the importance of the moment. And Lenin famously, I think, is a master of this kind of thing. And so this is something that we should recognize in Lenin. And if you see that as valuable, then you will see that against a lot of other tendencies in Lenin's thinking, which seem to me to be positivist, looking for law-like generalizations in history, which is against historicist thinking generally. Some of Lenin's own thinking, as I said about Althusser, where it is uh, truly thoughtful and useful, that thinking is actually historicist. So let me now turn to the question of historicism in Gramsci, because that is our major topic today. Gramsci comes to historicism in two stages, as it were. He reads Hegel. Gramsci is a very, very well trained person philosophically. He goes through a very good system of intellectual training, which has a very wide range. It is also very deep in the sense that it gives him familiarity with the basic, intricate arguments of different philosophical systems. So he has a grasp of Hegelian historicism directly, but we must remember that historicism comes to Gramsci through Croce. So if some of you are interested in following this up more, you should look at Croce as somebody who mediates the historicism of Hegel into Gramsci through his own emphasis on different aspects of historicism. So let me now turn to the six moves, historicizing moves in Gramsci, uh, which I think makes him the uh, primary historicist in Western Marxism. And let me make another point very quickly. The main difference, to my mind, between the historicist strand and the positivist strand is the positivist strand actually looks for similarities in historical incidents and processes and tries to establish them as laws, historical laws, which are nature-like laws, right? And I personally feel that the tradition of Russian Marxism, which was derived from older radical Russian thought, from earlier thinkers who influenced Lenin particularly, like Chernyshevsky, Dobrolyubov, etc. That tradition was inclined in that direction, that they thought that the strength of Marxism came from the fact that it was able to produce generalizing laws of history from which we could understand the direction that history would take in any particular context. Historicists think of the power of Marxism, the analytical power of Marxism, in the opposite way. They believe that, you know, historical science basically means that you think of some general strand or structural tendencies in society, in capitalism, in your own country, in the capitalism in the world. But at every stage, you have to go through a historicizing and differentiating process, in the sense that what you look for when you are trying to understand history is historical difference. Not historical generalizations, not similarity between one revolution and another, though there are similarities, obviously. Revolutions are made by revolutionary classes. Revolutions are made when there's a revolutionary situation which is exploited, etc. So there are some similarities of that kind. But what is important is to understand historical difference. That is, I recently taught a course on which was called Reading Marx Historically, in which, after presenting Marx, I told them that I would now give you examples of how Marx was read outside of Western Europe, right? And I first took Russia, because Russia was very different from Western Europe. And that is why you need Lenin's theory of why, in spite of most Marxists thinking that the first revolution should occur in England or Germany, Lenin gives a very startling demonstration of the possibility of the first revolution occurring in Russia. To my mind, what is interesting about this is that he is making a historicizing move. He is essentially saying that the configuration of circumstances in Russia is different. It must be seen closely and correctly. And if you look at that, you will see, contrary to the generalizing ideas, the ideas which, the argument which says that a revolution is made possible by the simultaneous development of the large working class and a big bourgeoisie, where the working class becomes strong enough to make a demand for state power. It is only there that a revolution becomes possible. He makes a very startling contrary argument, saying that although Russia admittedly is the most backward capitalist country in Europe, because of the piling up of contradictions, which Althusser analyzes wonderfully in one of his essays, Contradiction and Overdetermination, Lenin argues that it is possible to think of a revolution in Russia rather than in Germany or England. So it is a historicizing move. So historicism essentially means that you try to look at the historical difference in each case. And I think Gramsci is one of the great thinkers in that. So let me show you what are the historicizing steps in Gramsci. The first step is the analysis of capitalism. But what is important in Gramsci's analysis of capitalism in Italy is the emphasis on late capitalism. It's very well known that in Capital Volume 1, the first part of Capital Volume 1 in Marx is very structural. It starts with a discussion of the commodity, etc. But around the 25th chapter, we can see that Marx's argument becomes more and more historical. He's not talking about the general nature of commodities, etc. He's now actually talking about capitalism in England, capitalism in France, capitalism in Germany. So it is not capitalism, but as Weber said in one of his passages famously, that what we study in history is not capitalism, but capitalisms in the plural. And although the first part of Capital seems to be concerned with capitalism, the second part of Capital becomes concerned more and more and more with capitalisms in the plural. And in that, there is an argument. It's a short argument, but it's a very famous one because all Marxists reading Capital thoroughly pick it up and understand its possibilities. At one point, Marx says that there are two ways in which capitalism develops in Europe. The first one he calls the truly revolutionary way, which is the way capitalism develops in England and France. And he thinks that there's a second way of the development of capitalism, which he calls late capitalism. This is the way capitalism develops in Germany, in Italy, Russia. All these societies are societies which show the features of late capitalism. Late capitalism means that the development of industry is not as great. Secondly, in the development of industry or the rise of capitalism, not merely private initiative, states actually play a very, very important role, which is linked to the idea of the passive revolution, which we shall come to in a moment. But the important thing is that he picks up this Marx's methodological refinement of the distinction between the first way and the second way of the evolution of capitalism, and suggests that all second wave countries also are not the same. That is, the passive revolution, which means that you have a capitalist transformation of the society and its culture, but it's led not merely by the forces of the capitalist class, the petty bourgeoisie, to some extent the working class as well, but it is actually led very powerfully by the state. So a whole lot of initiatives which are done by social forces in the early capitalist societies in England and France are done by the state in the late capitalist society by the power of the state. So that's why it is called a passive revolution. And so this is something that he takes from Marx's analysis, and this is actually directly a historicist move, that you see the analysis of capitalism as being two-layered. The upper layer of the analysis of capitalism is very general, abstract. That is what you get in the first part of Capital. But analysis of capitalism, even the economic analysis of capitalism, cannot be exhausted only by the first layer. Because if you simply stick to the first layer, you would be misled to generalize some of the tendencies that you get in the early capitalist societies and expect that that would be played out in all other societies. What Marx is saying is that do not expect that. Expect that as capitalism moves into new locales in history, capitalism would follow trajectories which are quite distinct. And if you really want to understand the specificity of capitalism, right, you must be sensitive to that. Let me make one last point about this first remark. Uh, Quite often Marxists would say that there's a universalizing tendency in the rise of the capitalist economy, right? But the term universal here can be read in two different ways. We do not always remember that there are two forms of the universal. I'll give you an example, simple, commonsensical example. If we say that the structure of the human body is universal, it means that, if I look at human beings in Japan or India or America, they would all have two eyes, one nose, and one head, etc. So universal here means something which is invariant, right? So let us call that the invariant form of the universal. But if you take another example, which is equally important and common, think of the universality of language in human society. Language is equally universal. But if you look at the way in which language is universal, you will see it's a different mode of universality. Uh, it does not mean that wherever we go in human societies, we encounter the same language. What it means is that wherever we go in human societies, we encounter language, but not the same language. So it is a variant universal. It is universal, but not invariant. It is variant. So if you make a distinction between so we must be aware that the term universal should not blind us, to its internal distinction between a variant and an invariant form. And therefore, the first argument about capitalism is that if you follow the logic of Marx's own analysis in volume 1 of Capital, and also some parts of where Marx talks about the evolution of a capitalist economy in the whole world in volume 3, which are in the form of notes. They are not actually fully written out. You will see this logic that he believes that capitalism has a universalizing tendency, but wherever capitalism goes, it interacts with earlier forms of economic production. It interacts with an environment of culture, which is quite different and specific. And so therefore, there would be a rise of capitalism, but you should not expect the rise of capitalism to defeat the forms that you get in England and France, right? So this is the historicist logic in the economic analysis of capitalism itself, when somebody uses the concept of late capitalism from Marx and then runs with it in trying to understand the economy in his or her own society. The second question, the second feature that is historicist is the concept of hegemony. The concept of hegemony is new in the sense that I personally believe that if you read Marx towards the end of his life, and remember, Marx is also, in my view, Marx is a very strongly historicist thinker. And one part of being a historicist thinker is not very philosophical, but also you're being very sensitive to historical changes that are happening around you. And I would advise you, for instance, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, to notice something which is very interesting, extraordinary. Look at the number of introductions that prefaces that the Communist Manifesto has. The Communist Manifesto has 13 prefaces. So why do you write 13 prefaces to the same book? You are not making any changes in the book itself, but the whole point is that he understands that the political situation, the structure of the political order in Europe changes gradually, and the arguments that are made in the Communist Manifesto have to be adapted, to an evolvingly different historical situation. So that is why you have 13 prefaces. But the important point is here that during Marx's time, Marx did not see any really modern democratic forms of political power. The kind of states that Marx encountered were essentially Lockean states, that is, states in which political power belonged to the bourgeoisie in a certain sense. It was not based on universal franchise. It was based essentially on constitutionalist arrangements, which have certain types of democratic, or I think it's better to say proto-democratic tendencies. But Gramsci, by the time we come to, but let me make another point. But Marx saw one thing which he finds intriguing, and this is reflected in his correspondence with Engels and Engels' own writings when he survives Marx. This is that in 1875, Germany introduces universal male suffrage, right? Which is a big, I think it's actually one of the greatest historical changes in the nature of political power and political life. It takes a few more decades until 1929 for it to turn into universal suffrage, including women. But in 1875, there's universal male suffrage. And Marx, having this very sharp historical sense, perceives a difficult question for him. The question is that if it is true, as he believed, that the capitalist societies were evolving in a way in which there is a greater polarization of the classes. The intermediate classes are pressured from two sides, and a small part rises and joins the bourgeoisie, but a larger part actually falls into the proletariat. So the size of the proletariat, the numbers of the proletariat increase through the logic of the development of capitalism itself. And during Marx's time, this increasingly large proletariat did not have political rights, particularly right to vote, right? And Marx's expectation was that if they are given the right to vote, they would vote in their self-interest. And therefore, if you move towards universal suffrage, for instance, Marx was a great supporter of the Chartist movement. And I would advise you, those of you who are interested in this, to look at, there's an old Soviet collection called Articles on Britain, which puts together Marx's journalistic commentary on the Chartist movement and different incidents in British political life primarily. And you can see Marx's commentary on the implications of the universal suffrage. But the point is very powerful but simple. So the expectation is that the proletariat is becoming larger in terms of numbers as an economic class. It doesn't have political rights, so obviously it cannot actually impose its will on the state. But if after some time, democratic institutions emerge in which they can do it, the right to vote is given to everyone, and now includes the whole of the proletariat, right? Then it is very likely that the proletariat would actually bring in a socialist government. They would vote for socialist parties. Socialist parties would win elections, and then they would actually start changing the structure of society in a kind of progressive socialistic direction. But Marx realizes that even after the introduction of the universal male suffrage, that kind of equation does not take place, very quickly. And that raises the question of ideology from Marx's point of view, which then turns into the question to which hegemony in Gramsci is an answer. That is, why is it that in a society where the proletariat has the right to vote, it does not vote for parties or groups which act in its interest? Large numbers of proletarian populations actually vote for parties or act with parties which are opposed to the interest of the proletariat. This actually then becomes the most important question that requires an analysis and an explanation. And as you can see, the moment you think about it, what does the concept of hegemony do? The concept of hegemony offers an explanation of this. That is, in classical Marxism, I think, was poor in its analysis of the apparatuses of the state. It neglected the analysis of state power, particularly the question of power in a in an emerging democratic society. And through the theory of hegemony, Gramsci actually offers a much more sophisticated theory of political institutions. And he corrects the underemphasis on the state in earlier Marxist thought. And he offers a most sophisticated theory of explaining how you can have a democratic form of polity, but also a surviving capitalist form of the economy. That is, the rise of democracy, rise of electoral democracy does not necessarily mean an immediate collapse of the capitalist economy and structures. So this is something which is explained through the concept of hegemony. He also does something which is very interesting. This is something that I want you to keep in mind. Through this, I'm deliberately doing a slightly exaggerated contrast between Gramsci and Lenin, but I believe that the point that I'm making is a valid point. In Lenin, I sometimes argue when I'm teaching that I wish Lenin wrote a different book, or at least a second book after the State and Revolution, because the focus of the book, State and Revolution, is how a revolution is possible. In spite of the great power of the state, it is possible to make a revolution, right? Lenin's theoretical thinking, I think, broadly finishes there. Detailed theoretical thinking, detailed analysis of things finishes there. If you ask the question, if you reverse the order, revolution, and make it revolution and the state, meaning now we have made the revolution, how do we think about the state? How do we think about a state which does not become an oppressive state, like the state that we have undermined and replaced, right? I don't think there is much thinking in Lenin about this, not unnaturally, because he's somebody whose main task is to make the revolution, right? But once the revolution is made, so how to sustain the revolution? What should be the character of the change of social power under the revolution actually becomes the most important question. How to make the revolution now ceases to be the central question because the revolution already made. How to sustain revolutionary power and what should be the nature of revolutionary power, right, becomes the central question. And I think in Gramsci's theory of hegemony also yields a sophisticated theory of revolutionary situations. And his famous discussion about the war of movements and war of positions, etc., that talks about a revolutionary situation. But the underlying idea is that sustenance of the revolution is a very important question, and it is essential for the socialists to generate or elicit from society a creation of a kind of social consent, right? If revolutionary power is not based on social consent, if revolutionary power is based on the preponderance of violence, let's say 10 years after the revolution, 20 years, 50 years after the revolution, it remains revolutionary power in that narrow, violent form, which was required at the point of the revolution. Then I think Gramsci does not give us a very detailed analysis of this. But the whole point about the question of hegemony, that just as the capitalist democratic state functions smoothly because of not merely the political violence of the bourgeoisie, but the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Similarly, a socialist revolution can succeed only if it is not based on the continuing violence of the socialist state, but the hegemony of the socialist state. So the question of hegemony in Gramsci, in my view, has two stages or two forms. There is a highly developed question, analysis of hegemony in the capitalist state, but that actually shows us an implication about how the concept of hegemony is very important in a socialist state after the socialist revolution. The demand for a kind of hegemonic dominance of the society rather than violent suppression of the society. I think if you take this can actually become a very interesting point of critique and understanding for us who are sympathetic to socialism about what happens in socialist societies after the revolution, in the Soviet Union, in China, and why is it that 70 years after the revolution, in the Soviet Union and in many other parts of the world, the socialist political order simply crumbled. I think there is a suggestion in Gramsci, if you take the question of hegemony to be important, not merely in the analysis of capitalism, but also in the analysis of socialism for that question. Now, two or three much simpler points, because I time in talking about these two, because these are not obviously historicist arguments, but I want to tell you that, in my view, Gramsci could not have made these arguments about late capitalism and hegemony if he had not been a historicist. Now, this simpler historicist point, Gramsci, notice this, that historical difference means your capacity to notice historical difference within your own society, right? And he takes up the theory, which is you can get there get that in Marx, but the Russian Marxists developed this theory even more, Lenin, Trotsky, etc., which is the theory that when capitalism spreads, it constantly produces internal unevennesses of development. Capitalism, particularly late capitalism, does not develop capitalism evenly across the whole society. One part of the society becomes industrialized. In Germany, Western Germany becomes industrialized. And as a result of that, the rest of Germany, the eastern part of Germany, becomes an agricultural hinterland. This is not a natural order of things. This is a result of the development of a capitalist economy, but in an uneven form. This is the logic of late capitalism. So he applies that to Italy. In Italy, when capitalism develops, it develops in the north. And the southern part of the country actually becomes a backward agricultural hinterland. And this is analyzed, I think, wonderfully, great detail, with great sophistication, in his analysis of what he calls the Southern question. What is the Southern question? The Southern question is the question of historical difference inside Italy, right? So this is a typical historicist move. Then the fourth point, which I think is also a very important and interesting point, Gramsci does not develop it very much. I think you will get a development of this strand of thought, the fourth one, more in Mao, because in some ways Mao faced the question in a more acute form, which is the question of the peasantry. So the fourth historicist argument, in my view, is his emphasis on the question of the peasantry. Because if in Germany, in Italy, you need to have a revolution, the proletariat is too small. The proletariat can be well organized, and it can actually bring about, exploiting a situation of crisis, a Bolshevik-like revolution, right? Where a small, highly organized minority, which Lenin likened to a clenched fist, the disciplined party, can actually bring about a change in government. But a revolution is not just a change in government. The revolution is a change in society in all its aspects. And therefore, in Italy, if the peasantry is not persuaded to have a revolutionary ideology, right, then the revolution is going to spin into a crisis or fail, because the peasantry is actually the majority of the working people in Italian society. So we should not fudge the problem by simply saying that it is the workers, the working people who have made the revolution. The working people are clearly divided between the proletariat, who have one kind of orientation historically, and the peasantry, which has a very different kind of orientation, essentially concentrated in the south. And so you need a different theory of the peasantry as an agent of revolution. And this has to be already quite different from Marx's dismissal of the peasantry as a revolutionary force. Because we remember that, Marx, while discussing France, said that the revolutionary is like a sack of potatoes, and the peasantry can never be formed into a revolutionary force. So he clearly, because of his historical situation in a country, which is predominantly agricultural country, where one force of the revolution must be the peasantry, right? So he is forced to develop a theory which repudiates Marx's dismissal of the peasantry, right? Which is also the logic of a historicist form of thinking. Now, when we come to Mao, we shall find that Mao is faced with a situation where the question of whether the peasantry can be a revolutionary force is a much more decisive question. Because if you give a Marx answer to that question, that the peasantry can never be a revolutionary force, you are basically saying that there can never be a revolution in China. But if following Gramsci, you can say that there are some conditions under which the peasantry can become a revolutionary force, and we should try to do it, then of course a Chinese revolution becomes possible. So there is a theoretical connection here, not directly, between Gramsci's concern with the southern question, the peasantry, and the question of Catholicism and religion, which is the next point I'll come to in a moment, and Mao's thinking about the peasant revolution. The fifth point is the question of Catholicism. And I want to, because you have studied with Arun. Arun is a very good scholar of not merely Gramsci, but what I find interesting about his thinking about India is that unlike more conventional Marxists, and I think quite rightly, and this is the Gramscian move, he thinks that if you really want to understand Indian society well, you must understand how, what religion is, what forms of religion, how religion functions, and things like that. But remember, I would immediately make another point. You should notice how careful Gramsci is in this analysis, because he bypasses, this actually involves your reading the text itself closely. He bypasses the more abstract general categories like religion, used by Marx. Religion is the opium of the people, right? What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is this. You must learn to notice this sort of thing. Marx does not say Catholicism is the opium of the people. Protestantism is the opium of the people. It's a general category. Religion is the opium of the people, right? Now, Gramsci, you will see, rarely uses that general category. Gramsci is constantly raising the question, not of religion, which is abstract and general, but of Catholicism, which is historicist, because that is the religion which is present in front of Gramsci, and which is actually producing both the problems and the possibility for his revolutionary activity in Italy. So historicist thinking, as I told you, if you read Dilthey closely, you will see that the whole point, emphasis, is that you must understand the particular, you must understand the specificity, you must understand what is particular, unique to this situation that you are dealing with, and don't get, deluded by general laws of history and things like that, because that is what you will have to deal with. So you have to attend to the southern question. The southern question is the question of the peasantry. Whether the peasantry can act as a revolutionary force or not, how the peasantry thinks, and how the peasantry is likely to respond to socialist ideas or revolutionary political practice depends on Catholicism, because they think through the categories of Catholicism. And therefore, for Marx, even by other Marxists, sometimes they see religion as a problem and therefore deserving of analysis. Gramsci does not use religion very often, but Catholicism, which immediately implicitly gestures towards something that uh, discussions on Weber has noticed more recently, for instance, in the work of Jose Casanova, that Southern Europe is not just more religious. This is an important point. If you look at the contemporary discussions coming out of the work of, let's say, discussions about Charles Taylor's book, The Secular Age, or Jose Casanova's book about public religion, Casanova makes the same point, which I think is the correct point. He says that we should not say that Southern Europe is more religious. He said that it's very important to say that Southern Europe is Catholic. It's religious, but in the form of Catholicism. So saying Southern Europe is more religious says one thing, and saying it is Catholic says something else, right? And For instance, what does it mean? It means that if you say that, which also raises interesting questions for us. For instance, take Savarkar, Essentials of Hindutva, right? He talks constantly about Hinduism, right? But if you look at, I have talked about it a little bit in an old paper which I had, which is called On Thick and Thin Religion, where I said that if you asked my grandfather, who was a deeply religious man, what is your religion? I don't think he would have said that my religion is Hinduism. He would have said that my religion is Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And let me come back to my general argument. We can take it up for discussion later. So it is actually the difference between saying that Hinduism is very dominant in India, or I find Hinduism in my area in Orissa, and I find Hinduism in Bengal. Somebody says that I find Hinduism in some other part of the country, and saying that what I find here is Shaiva religion or Vaishnava religion, or even more, the variations between, let us say, the Gaudiya Vaishnava religion, which dominates Bengal and Odisha, but a different form of Vaishnava religion dominates South India or North India. So what is this? This is actually exactly the logic of historicism. Historicizing your understanding. What is specific? What is determinate here? What actually makes it separate from or distinct from other things with which we can easily confuse it? So the last point, which again is slightly abstract, but anybody who reads Gramsci closely would be impressed by that. He is also very attentive to the logic of periodization of Italian history. So he resists the idea that you can actually have a general periodization of history for the whole of Europe, right? For instance, in England, you have the rise of capitalism at a particular point, and then the rise of capitalism and the rise of capitalist modernity continues more or less, unimpeded for the next 200-300 years. Italian history is very different. Italian history has the kind of, big advent of modernity, very early modernity at the time of the Renaissance, introduces some very, very important ideas on the one side through the literary Renaissance and Renaissance thinking in Machiavelli, let us say, very important ideas which had never been there in European thought before. But Italian society does not change fundamentally or profoundly for a very long time, right? So his attention to the periodization of Italian history shows that periodization must be done through periodization categories that are developed from within the big events of European history, rather than smothering them with a larger, more general European periodization taken from England and France and things like that. So why should the French Revolution be a revolutionary break for everybody outside of France? In Italy, you have two breaks. You have the break at the time of the Renaissance, and then you also have a break at the time of what you call the Risorgimento, right? So it is not a French revolutionary kind of break. And so the French Revolution, or that kind of periodization, is a kind of second order history, which we always use, like the rise of capitalism, but it should not smother the first order history, historical periodization, which is much closer to the ground, much closer to the facts of a case in a particular region. I'll give you an example. For instance, take the question of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, right? Because Arun and I have talked about it quite often. I've also given lectures to groups of people who are based in Odisha. What is interesting is that, of course, there is a kind of general, larger formation, uh, which you can find in Bengal, parts of Assam, Manipur, and of course, Odisha, which is a very big center of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But if you look at it closely, you will see that the evolution of Gaudiya Vaishnavism itself, goes in somewhat different ways, trajectories, in Bengal and in Odisha. So what Gramsci's theorization or Gramsci's periodization shows us is that periodization also should be sensitive to the demands of historicism. And sometimes we need periodizations at many different levels. There can be a high-level periodization, which is for the whole of India or the whole of Eastern India. But if you do not have more local periodizations, for your understanding of your more local history, then I think you will fall into errors of overgeneralization and things like that. So I think the question of periodization of history in Italy is also very, very interesting. And he shows us something which is methodologically very powerful and productive. Let me make a very big point, but very quickly, about Althusser. These are the 6 ways in which I think I would like to claim that Gramsci is actually a historicist thinker. And there are 2 strands of thinking in Marxism, within Marxism. One is historicist, and the other is deliberately anti-historicist. Gramsci is one of the great exemplars of the historicist form of thinking in Marxism. I told you that I'm also a great admirer of Althusser in some parts of his work. And because of that, I have to take a decision from my side about Althusser's criticism of historicism. I think Althusser makes a point which is very valuable and in some ways connected to the last point that I made. If you read that chapter, Marxism is not a historicist, he's talking about the same thing. He's actually saying that we must have times and subtimes, temporality and subtemporality in a certain sense. There would be a kind of temporalization, that is periodization of European history, but under European history, you can have sub-periodizations of German history, Italian history, etc. Althusser does not give this example. He gives a different kind of example of disaggregating historical time or disaggregating historical periodization. He says, for instance, that we take the general periodization of capitalism. But I'm studying not the capitalist economy, I'm studying the history of literature in a particular country. And there's no reason why the punctuations of history that I find in the history of capitalism should also be the punctuations of history in the history of literary thought, in the history of literary aesthetics, right? So his argument in that chapter, I think, is a very valuable argument, which says that when you are dealing with features of culture, when you are dealing with political history, history of the state, then you must be aware that you should work with a different sub-periodization. And if you have these periodizations of the different, substructures of social life, then the problem of periodization becomes much more complicated. That is, what is the difference laterally between periodization of cultural history and political history and economic history? Can we then think of a larger, sort of more general periodization of some kind? So these are some of the questions which come up. If we play Althusser's critique of historicism and Gramsci's practice of historicism, in conversation with each other, which would generate questions and answers, hopefully, for us. So let me, Arun, can I go for another 5 minutes? Yeah, I'll take just 5 minutes, essentially to mention a few things which we can take out of Gramsci's analysis for India. Yeah. So let me simply read out what I had written down for my last lecture for you. The consequence of the reading of Gramsci as a historicist, taking historicism seriously for people like us, should be to note that its character leads to a kind of cognitive interruption for us. It forces us to stop and ask a question, but to stop in 2 different senses. First, to stop the flow of the argument, whose primary historical content is almost entirely European, and particularly West European, and to consider continually Weber or Marx or Tony, and because all of them are essentially concerned with a part of European experience which is different from the European experience that you get in places like Italy or Spain or Portugal, which is also part of Europe, the southern part of Europe. So the first interruption is that we have to say that after doing this from European history, let us do this again by using examples from Indian history, right? And I have another point which is a bit more difficult in the sense that it goes into a slightly different direction of Weber's secularization and things like that. I would skip that and turn to two or three other things that I think come from Gramsci. The first question is, we have to ask, which are the concepts or arguments that we get in Gramsci, which could be applied directly to some parts of our understanding of Indian history? So I think the second way, the argument about late capitalism, is of that kind. I think it would give us a way of thinking about the rise of capitalism in India, which is valuable. The question of the passive revolution, which particularly me and Partha Chatterjee used extensively at one time. I have now a slightly different opinion on this. I think broadly what we were trying to do was quite right, that we were trying to capture the specificity of Indian history. And because passive revolution allowed Gramsci to capture the specificity of Italian history, it was right and wrong at the same time. Right in the sense that the concept itself is historicism. The concept itself actually asks us to ask the question, what is the difference in the rise of capitalism or capitalist processes in your society? And Gramsci answered that by looking at the specificities of Italian history. We have to do that on Indian history. So that is what we try to do by using the passive revolution. But probably it might, some people have told me later that it could have been done better if you had not used the concept of passive revolution. Because some people might feel that, well, instead of using a concept from Marx or concept from Lenin, all that you were doing was essentially to get a concept from another thinker that you like and plonk it on Indian history. But that is not what we intended to do. So if you look at Partha's writing and my writing, you will see that is one, that is clear. Subaltern studies explored the line of thought about peasantry as a radical agent of history. So it is not surprising that if you look at the Marxist intellectual influences of subaltern studies, the two great Marxist influences are Mao, to some extent, not so explicitly, but also obviously Gramsci. Now, the second question that I think comes out of this, if we follow Gramsci, the main question would be, what are the defining features of the Indian social form, right? Just as Gramsci was looking for the defining features of the Italian social form, that is the southern question, the peasantry, the Catholicism, etc. And if we do that, I think then obviously we have to deal with the question of internal regional diversity, not always a diversity that is created by the rise of capitalism itself. In India, there are other historical reasons for the production of diversity, but the diversity of language, cultural diversity, and things like that. And something which I have called in my work occasionally, a kind of convex form of diversity, which means that if you take linguistic diversity of Indian people and think of language and regionality as a plane, that is one plane of diversity. I'm using the term plane now more seriously, a plane of diversity, like a piece of paper on which we have drawn a design of linguistic difference, right? Then there's a separate plane of diversity of, let's say, caste formation, right? Which does not map onto directly the diversities of regional variation. So you have a caste plane where, again, you have to have a map of diversity. Then you have to have a religious plane, of the different forms of Hinduism, Islam, and things like that, and a map similarly. So the interesting thing is that the map of diversity in India, sometimes the language of diversity that we use becomes misleading, because it seems to indicate that there is a single plane on which all these diversities work. There are many different planes, but if you really want to understand how the Indian society works, particularly the problem of diversity works in Indian society, you have to, if suppose we did these as, what geographers do, maps on rice paper, transparent paper, and then we put one paper on top of the other. We have all these three papers, one on top of the other. The picture that you get through that is actually the picture of diversity in India. But whereas in other societies, diversity is usually planar, a single plane diversity. The diversity that we get in India is a convex form of diversity, which requires an analysis, historicist analysis of much greater complexity and sensitivity. So let me finish by making a simple statement. So I have thought about this question for a long time. What does following Gramsci mean? I started thinking about this when I was in Oxford, and I was trying to write a book on Indian politics, which I half wrote, I never published. I brought it up, the historical analysis, up to the end of the Nehru period, and then I sort of ran out of steam. I never finished this. But I thought that, the major idea that I had at that point was that I was dissatisfied with a kind of reductionist, highly economistic understanding of Indian politics, Indian political life that Marxists offered. I wanted to do something which was different from that. And there were two things which I tried to do. One was to draw a lot of ideas from structuralism, like structural causality and things like that, which I drew essentially from Althusser. But on the other side, I also felt that my analysis, if I really wanted to follow Gramsci, I should not take concepts from Gramsci and try to apply them to India. Following Gramsci means essentially not to follow Gramsci in the vulgar sense. Following Gramsci essentially means trying to set up between me and my historical object, India, Indian political life, exactly the kind of methodological relationship that he establishes between him and the historical political life of Italy. So following Gramsci is not following Gramsci in the usual sense, but to strike off into a tangent of original thinking, away from the thinking that had existed before and that had come down to us. And so if you interpret following Gramsci this way, then I would say that, even our attempt in the 70s and 80s, by using the passive revolution concept, etc., it was a kind of beginning. But what we need is a much more historicist expansion of this kind of analysis for India. And seen this way, the work of a kind of Gramscian understanding of Indian history, I don't think has gone very far. It has just begun. And this is how I think we should try to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudipta. It's very elaborate and extensive talk. You highlighted the 6 features of historicism. Should be picked up by students. Let us see how debate develops. Yeah, questions and comments welcome.
Give me just a minute. I'll come back. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Any comment and question from the audience?
Arun, I can't hear anything.
Yeah, I'm also waiting for a response. No, nobody has asked the question. Sudipta, let me ask, if no question is there, let me ask one or two questions. You made an interesting point about the two forms of universal.
Yeah.
The variant and invariant.
Hmm.
Elsewhere, you made an interesting point about two meanings of concept, empty and field.
Hmm.
Do you think the idea of invariant universal is where these two distinctions disappear, empty and core. They look like only single. And in case of variant universal, distinctions appear. What is empty and what is core? And therefore, you can distinguish them and say the empty could be universal of one kind, and core is a description of particular. A concept absorbs the universal and the particular at any point of time. Therefore, when you're trying to read a concept from a different region in your history, you have to basically first distinguish what is empty and what is core, and then take out the core from it, and you may adapt the empty, and then fill up with your own core. Do you think that possibility is there in the distinction of the universal?
I don't think they are closely linked, but they are responses to similar problem. In the sense that I'll tell you what I think the empty and filled is something which is very simple in my view. But let me tell you why I thought of that, because that would make it very clear. You know, I was thinking about, I've always thought um, about the method of Marxist thinking about history. And I was thinking about uh, the Communist Manifesto. And what was the methodological structure of Communist Manifesto argument? And I felt that what Marx was doing was, he was very quickly, if you think of a diagram, very quickly, at that point, of course, he had not studied non-European history very closely, India or the colonies. So his historical thinking was very limited. But within that, he was interested, after all, in a theoretical understanding of capitalism, mainly. But what is remarkable about him was that he thought that he could not get into the task of producing a theory of capitalism without a historical view, which asks the question, where did capitalism come from? What existed before capitalism? So to do that, what he does is very quickly, he produces an argument which I would put in a diagram like this. I would draw a straight line, which is the line of history, of time, and a sequence of social forms. Primitive communism is the first, let's say, circle, then slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and then later on, probably socialism. I felt that in the Communist Manifesto, all the earlier concepts, slave society, feudal society, to some extent, even capitalist society, are relatively empty concepts. Empty in the sense that you only have the outer outline, the outer boundary of that. You do not have very much describing what the form is like, what are its internal contradictions, what are its structures and things like that. It's a very preliminary sketch. And that is why it is generally empty. I might have told you, and probably it's there in that essay as well, I've forgotten now. The concept of the idea of an empty concept is like this, that I'm standing on one side of of a field, and there are a row of houses on the other side of the field, right? And if you ask me, describe the second house from the left, and I tell you that it's a two-story house. In the lower story, there's one door and 5 windows, and the upper story, there's no door. There are 2 windows, etc. So I can give you particulars. This is linked to the historicism question. I can give you the particulars of the second house from the left, right? But if you ask me, describe the back of the second house from the left, I cannot describe it, except for saying that, I know that there's a back of the house, because, front and back logically are related like that. So there is a back. And I know that there are determinations on the back. There would be walls and windows and doors possibly, but I cannot tell you what these are, right? So there's a kind of cognitive suspension of that description, simply because, the cognitive process of finding out what the determinations are is not possible or has not begun, right? So that is an empty concept. And my understanding was that if you look at the concept of slave society, feudalism, in the Communist Manifesto, these are empty in that sense. There's a kind of bare minimal description, but Marx needs that minimal description in order to produce a similar empty concept for capitalism, but then start filling it up with theory, which he starts doing from the Communist Manifesto itself. So that after doing that sequence, the rest of the book does not bother about feudalism, slave society. It is only bothered about capturing the features of the capitalist economy. And then, if you look at Marx's work from then on to the end of his life, he does not get into those things at all. In fact, the whole life is essentially filling out that concept of capitalism through Grundrisse, through contributions to the critique of political economy, 3 volumes of Capital. Then the question is, how do people think about capitalism? So that produces theories of surplus value. So if you take what I call the capital complex, that is, starting from the Grundrisse to the theories of surplus value, which would make about 10 volumes, if you put all of them together, what these writings are trying to do is essentially to fill that empty concept of capitalism that we got in the Communist Manifesto. So that is my idea of the empty concept. And I simply felt, and I think you have felt it more strongly than me, that the distinction between the empty and filled concepts, which I take from Husserl, is something which is which is useful in many different contexts, which is of course possible because anything which is a logical operation always has the possibility of being useful in other contexts. The other thing, between the variant and the invariant, I think there are some universals which are really invariant universals. But the important thing is to identify what is a variant and what is an invariant one. Because otherwise what happens is that, if we simply use the term universal loosely, then the only meaning of universal is of an invariant universal. And then what happens is that, we should use the term universal in the second sense, but because of the dominance of the first meaning and the general casual adoption of the first meaning by thinkers, the first meaning overrides the second. And that creates problems. For instance, take the example of Hinduism. In not only in Savarkar, but a lot of other people. The trouble is that at some point, you have to say that, well, a description of Hinduism as Hinduism is not adequate. Hinduism is an internally very diverse form of religion. So I must actually, it is like the problem that we find when we talk about Indian politics. I have a paper in which I have discussed that when I write about Indian politics, what am I writing about? Um, and some people would say that there's nothing called India, right? There's only Bengal, there's only Odisha and Andhra, etc., or even sub-region. And when you talk about India, it is something which is a metaphysical, it's a false category, because if there's always the possibility, the danger of generalization, that what I see, what I understand is only Bengal, and then I casually believe that since it is true of Bengal, it must be true of India. Right. Or we say that there's nothing called India. It's essentially only these regions which are real. I think both these positions are faulty. India is real, and I made that point because it's an interesting but paradoxical point as well, that you can see the effect of India, the reality of India, if you, let us say, see the effect of the federal structure. That is, if you have, and I pointed out that in India, quite often you have a situation where there are dominant parties and dominant leaders of the parties in different regions, who are so dominant that if that region had been a separate state, as a kind of thought experiment, then that state would have been an authoritarian, single party dominated state, right? And so there are, let's say, 7, 8 different parts of India where you had a situation like that. Let's say CPM dominance in West Bengal at one point, a dominance of people like Bansilal or Devilal in Haryana, the dominance of Mulayam Singh Yadav in UP or Lalu Yadav in Bihar, etc., etc. But the very interesting thing is that if you force them to stay together in a place called India, then their incentives become structured in a very interesting way. They would like to keep their dominance in their region, but when they come to the center and enter into a negotiation about institutions in this center, they would want the central institutions to be democratic, because they would not want to be dominated, by somebody else from a different region, which would not have happened if all these states in the Indian Federation had become independent states. So I think, so my point is that, India is very real. And so therefore, when we theorize something like that, we should find a way of composing this picture. Composing meaning avoiding generalization, avoiding the idea that there's nothing which connects them together, right? And in many, many cases, for instance, in Indian political life, we have to do that. I think when you try to understand Hinduism, the immense diversity of Hinduism, both in terms of ideas, in terms of practices, and things like that. those need not to be distorted and not to be brought under a kind of vague generalization, right? But gradually and painstakingly, built into pictures which are like that, which is the historicist's task. That is what Dilthey would say, or any methodological historicist would say, what we ought to do. And they would say that, we call our theory historicism, because that is the only way in which you can understand anything that is a historical fact. A human fact is always historical. A human social fact can be understood only that way, by being sensitive to the particular, sensitive to the local, doing an accurate picture of that, and then not avoid the task of composing it into something which is, larger and larger, etc. And at every point you would have thresholds and boundaries, things like that. So it's a complex, but because it is so complex, it is also so interesting.
True. No, in a way you are right, because when you said Gramsci doesn't substitute the idea of religion. He argues that you can't have generic idea of religion. That is because there is no such religion. There is a women's Catholicism different from workers' Catholicism, and workers' Catholicism different from. And first of all, in religion you have Catholicism. Then within Catholicism, again, if you remember, you used to say while teaching that it's like onion metaphor. You peel off, you can see only onion. So it's like if you peel off Catholicism, you will see women's Catholicism, different from workers' Catholicism, different from petty bourgeois Catholicism, middle class bourgeois Catholicism, and so on, so on and so forth. Therefore, you don't have one Catholicism for everybody. Gramsci basically unpacks things very interesting way. That's what typically follows what we say methodological historicism quite brilliantly.
I also follow another methodological, it's a methodological technique, simple methodological technique. Many of these things which are very general, large bodies of ideas, like Marxism, liberalism, in the field of political philosophy, Hinduism, Islam, etc., in the field of religion. Let me give an example. I believe that the task that we face as intellectual analysts of these things is to try to preserve both the singularity of the fact and also the internal diversity and complexity. And we must find a technique methodologically to do that, because otherwise we fall into this trap that, there would be an overgeneralization. Let me give you an example from, let's say, either Hinduism or Islam. Take the case of Hinduism. Some people, if you talk to them, they would say, Hinduism, there is nothing as otherworldly and wonderful and, philosophical as Hinduism, because Hinduism is what we get in the Upanishads, or what we get in, let us say, the interpretation of the Upanishads in Advaita philosophy. Right? Now, and some people would say, no, Hinduism is a terrible thing. Hinduism is caste. Hinduism is what you get in the Manusmriti. Right? Now, the interesting thing is that if you're a historicist, you must recognize that Hinduism encompasses, on the one side, both the Upanishad and the Manusmriti. Right? But it also raises an interesting question. There are internal contradictions, sometimes differences of emphasis, right, between these different texts, between these different complexes of ideas. So the question would be, then how do we characterize something like this? Again, remember that many very clever sociologists or social scientists would say, well, there's nothing called Hinduism, really, or there's nothing called Islam, because in Islam you have the same thing, that Islam is a religion of conquest. Islam is constantly saying that everybody else is kafir, etc. And on the other side, you have a picture of Islam as a religion of peace, a religion which says that in case of religion and conversion, there can be no violence, etc. So you get that, both these things in the history of Islam. Just as if you go back to the history of Marxism, and if you want to make it more acute, you have the difference not merely of Gramsci and Lenin, or Stalin and Gramsci, but also, let's say, Marx and Pol Pot, right? So there would not have been any Pol Pot if there hadn't been something called Marxism, right? But Pol Pot is not something with which we want to align ourselves in any sense. But we cannot deny that there's, this is part of history. So my response to this is a very simple technique. I say it's a technique taken from structuralism that, these are like alphabets. So the English alphabet has only 26 components, 26 letters. And everything that has ever been said in the English language is a combination and recombination of those 26, if you go back to the structuralist language, elements, right? Now, so if I say that Hinduism has these different types of elements, right? A Shaiva part, a Shakta part, a Vaishnava part, etc. And those, again, following structuralists, you can decompose them. And the advantage of saying that it is a structure means that you do not see it as an internally consistent doctrine, which every Hindu uses. Right? You can say that just as we use different parts of the alphabet to make our sentences, and there's no sense in asking whether the alphabet is good or bad, right? Or alphabet is nice or not nice, right? Because that is not the character of the alphabet. So similarly, we can avoid judgments on that very large scale about Marxism as a whole, liberalism as a whole, Hinduism. Is Hinduism a religion of oppression, or is Hinduism a religion of philosophical wonder, right? We can say that Hinduism is not unified by a doctrine historically. But there are parts of Hinduism which has tight doctrinal internal knit, internal structure, and that is how we should look at it. So if you see it as an alphabet, then I think to some extent we can avoid this problem that people use different parts of the alphabet to achieve different types of purposes, and they produce doctrine, they produce theologies and things like that. And it is the congeries of all that historically, which we call Hinduism. And the more it exists in history, the more it goes through historical elaboration, which is inevitable, as in case of Marxism. So if you think of Marxism at the time when Marx is alive, it's very small, tight. It's a doctrine-like thing, right? By the time you come to Lenin, you see that Marxism has actually elaborated into social democracy, Kautsky, Bernstein on one side, and Lenin on the other side, right? You allow more time, then you have greater elaboration of Marxism across the world. And the more elaborate it becomes difficult to see it as a kind of singular doctrine, right? There is a kind of singularity. I would not say that, therefore, the category of Marxism itself becomes useless. Some people would say that. No, I would not. I would say that it's important to retain the singularity at one level, but also absolutely essential that we understand the particularities on the ground. Again, is somebody speaking? I cannot hear anything. Arun, you have to unmute yourself.
Rasakaram has asked a question. Can the idea of combined and uneven development be characterized as historicist thinking? Likewise, is the idea of bourgeois revolution historicist in nature?
Bourgeois revolution meaning?
Bourgeois revolutions, do you think they are historicist in nature? There are different kinds of bourgeois revolutions. So what is your take?
You mean my view on that?
Yeah, he wants your view. He wants your view. on these two. One is can the idea of combined and uneven development be characterized as historicist thinking?
Yeah. It is historicist in the simple sense that, the logic is similar between Gramsci is trying to understand, let us say, the internal complexity of religion and seeing the particularity of Italian Catholicism. What you added to our discussion was very important, because what you would have added would be the difference between, let's say, Catholicism in Italy and the Catholicism in Spain, right? So the drive to look at something which is particular and the real being the particular, right? That does not mean that, the tendencies that we find, the structural tendencies at an upper level, they're unreal. This is why I said that, we should not give up the idea of India, because there is something that is happening there, right? Now, so I think uneven and combined development is a very good illustration of trying to combine, these two demands of social theorizing. One is the demand of particularity, right? But what is interesting is that they're not also giving up the demand of looking for something which is a more general trend. So they're saying that there's a development of capitalism, but the development of capitalism is always combined and uneven and combined, right? So that is why I see that as an illustration of historicist thinking in a field which is quite interesting, because, economic thinking is not always self-consciously historicist, right? But to me, this is actually a very good example of how, even in economic thinking, something which is as abstract, as universalistic as the development of capitalism, there is a need for historicism. Because what is interesting is that you could say that, well, the development of some kind of capitalist form in Russia, in a particular industry, in a particular sector, happens initially in a way because it comes out of the earlier feudal economy, right? But as capitalism develops, there's no doubt that there are certain tendencies which are universal. So it would produce universal features or universalistic features as capitalism becomes strengthened, right? So that is what I find interesting, that, the ability to be able to think, both at the level of generality, which requires certain types of skill, and the ability to think about the particular, closely and in a granular way. That requires a different kind of skill. But the real understanding of history requires a kind of these two. I think the theory of uneven and combined development is a very good illustration of that, because it does not give up the idea of generality, but it mediates the idea of generality, sort of, it mixes the idea of generality with an idea of what is particular in the development of capitalism in each context. Because what is it doing? It's basically saying that, of course, capitalism has a generalizing tendency, but don't forget that there are particularities in each region, and that is something that you have to take into account. And also don't forget that there's also something else which is linked to the question of time. That at a particular point of time, let us say, take the question of the Indian Federation and its economic history. West Bengal is one of the most developed states at the time of independence, right? And the government acts that way, the central government treats it that way, etc. But it has gone through 70 years of development of a capitalist economy, right? Not of the European type, very different type, but still, it has gone through the development of a capitalist economy, right? And today, West Bengal is not one of the economically leading states of the Indian Union. So historicism would insist that this is something that you should keep in mind, right? So particularity not merely of the space of the territory, but also particularity of the time
Time.
is mixed with this. So history is always, if you use the terminology from a very different field, like Bakhtin comes from the field of literary theory. But Bakhtin has this very useful concept of the chronotopic. Chronotopic basically means that, you cannot think of time without topos, that is space. And you cannot think of topos, space, without time. You might not mention it very explicitly, but whenever you are doing historical analysis, the invocation of one, at least implicitly, always contains an invocation of the other. Because without that, historical analysis simply cannot succeed or would go wrong and become stupid.
Any other comment? We have just 8 minutes to go. I think we'll close by 10. We can take probably one comment or one question.
I have to finish soon.
Yeah. We'll close by 10. If no other question is there, let me request Rajat to give vote of thanks.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, for speaking and giving us such a condensed and illuminating talk on historicism and how Gramsci reflects certain historicist elements in his thinking and praxis. I also thank our Professor Patnaik for inviting Professor Kaviraj and allowing us to interact with the author that we have been reading since our undergraduate days. I would also like to thank the audience for coming, interacting, asking pointed questions, and making this lecture meaningful. Thank you,
Quite late
everybody.
at night in India.
What did you say? I could not hear.
No, I said it's quite late at night in India.
Yeah, very late. Yeah, I'm feeling a bit sleepy. So thank you, Sudipta. Good to spend some time for my students.
Thank you. I hope all of you get interested in Gramsci and historicism at the same time.
Yeah.
And
Thank
also
you.
start doing some reading, if you can, in some types of Indian philosophy, in logic and things like that.
Yeah. That's essential actually. You have to historicize Gramsci through them. KCB makes an interesting point. I'd like to end here. Makes an interesting argument. He said when you are connecting with a foreign guru, there is no harm in connecting with a foreign guru. It is important that you should see whether their ideals resemble our native intellectuals' ideals.
Yeah.
Only subject to that you connect. He makes an interesting argument. On that condition you connect. Otherwise, you will be displacing our history. That's an interesting point KSB makes actually. Swaraj idea.
The other thing that I feel is that I'm trying to read about Buddhism now because I'm very poorly informed about Buddhism, and I felt that Buddhism is such an important and powerful tradition, and I think Ambedkar makes a very, very important point that Buddhism is probably the tradition that we should turn to, because he thought all his life about what he should do through the rejection of Hinduism. And he thought of, Islam, Christianity. Ultimately, what he does, I think, is extremely interesting, and we do not think about it very closely, which is, I personally look at it slightly differently from Ambedkar, and probably Ambedkar would be critical of my position. He might actually say that, this is an upper caste move, but I don't think it's an upper caste move. But I think what he suggests is very valuable, because if the students are told that, turn to your own tradition, as they're told now every day, from every corner. A student can say that, why should I turn to a tradition which practices caste, which treats women like this, etc., etc. Right? It's not that only our tradition does that. I think every tradition, including the European tradition, has that problem. But that is an important problem that, so, but I think Buddhism does something very interesting, because many of the things which are very powerful and valuable in Hindu thought, except in one field, which I find very valuable, which is the field of philosophical aesthetics. Right? The Buddhists, for some reason, do not seem to have so much of interest in the aesthetic side. Right? But most of the other things which are powerful in the Hindu tradition, think of values like, let's say, Vinaya, non-arrogance, Karuna, compassion. The value of the intellect. That is, intellect is something which is one of the greatest gifts that human beings have. You should not neglect it. But at the same time, you should not overestimate it, because the intellect cannot solve all questions. And in some cases, it's not right to depend on the intellect. It's right to depend on your heart, and things like that. Many of these ideas are common between Hinduism, some forms of Hinduism, and Buddhism. And I feel a lot of Buddhist thought has been preserved, under a different name sometime, in Vaishnava thinking. Also, early Shaiva thinking, for instance, the Kashmiris did a lot of that. But when I look around the society around me, coming from Bengal, and also coming from a kind of Vaishnava sort of family background, I see a lot of these ideas still circulating, ideas which originally come from Buddhism. And if you want to have the most powerful articulation of those ideas, sometimes you do not get the most powerful articulation in Hinduism, but in Buddhism. Right? And so because of that, if you turn to Buddhism as one of your main tradition, you actually avoid some of the difficulties that you face, because Hinduism's intrication with caste and things like that. Right? But at the same time, it's a tradition which is Indic, and a tradition which speaks in a language which is still a language which is totally understandable in India. Because if you go into discussion of Buddhist philosophy and look at the language of the internal language of Buddhist philosophy, right? Anybody who is good at the vernacular, either knows Odia well, or Bengali well, or Hindi well, or Telugu well, I think they would immediately find that many of these things are actually quite familiar. So I personally feel that one of the major weaknesses for training of students is the blanking out of this. I do not think it is always a deliberate blanking out, because, people must understand. Even people who are leftists must understand, and people who are supporters of the BJP must also understand that the historical process has been very unkind, and it is very difficult to find people who know those things well, who can teach those things at a high level of sophistication. You can always find people who can give you lectures on pop Hinduism of a kind, which is not very helpful. But a really sophisticated understanding of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy is very hard.
Ambedkar underestimates significance of Vaishnavism.
Sorry?
Ambedkar underestimates significance of the Bhakti tradition.
Yeah, I think
response to Gandhi, if he replied to Gandhi, he makes his point clear. I don't value it, he says. He simply dismisses of, which is unfair, I thought.
I feel that is true. I'm not surprised by this, because, if you put yourself in the situation of Ambedkar, you can understand why he had so little sympathy for this. But on the other hand, if you look at someone, who died prematurely, but very interesting thinker about these things, D.R. Nagaraj, who was, interested He's very interested in
Very
Buddhism.
interesting scholar, yeah.
He has this very interesting book called The Flaming Feet.
No.
I had long discussions with Nagaraj about that, and he was very, very keen that people should try to acquire more knowledge of the Buddhist tradition, and it should be rendered easier. A student who goes into a university to do a BA degree in any social science, there should be possibility for them to acquire this sort of thing without going into a specialized, course on Buddhism or religion or something like that.
Okay, so thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
So most probably are you coming to India during summer vacation?
Not during summer. Summer is too hot.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I know.
next semester I'm on sabbatical, so I want to spend most of my time in India. But we'll probably go there sometime at the end of July.
Okay.
But we'll stay there till December.
Okay. I will catch up you personally, separately. Okay,
Okay.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Well, thank you.
Bye-bye.